Hello, everybody, and welcome in Mysteries with Mr. Belgic. That's me. Me- We have two Jerome and two Mr. B today.
That's right.
Jerome, Jerry, how are you doing?
Good. Very glad to be with you here today.
And thank you very much to have accepted my invitation to talk about you, your life, your job.
Sure.
You know. And I have Ned with me. Ned, how are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. Hello, everybody. I'm Ned Dahan, the co host for today. I'm the host of Black Box Online Radio here on YouTube, as well as some other things like True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And Jerry Buting, it's a pleasure to speak with you.
Likewise.
It is, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to do a little introduction about you, Mr. Buting.
Sure.
Jerome Buting is a shareholder in the Brookfield, Wisconsin law firm of Buting, Williams, and Stilling SC. He received his undergraduate degree in forensic study from Indiana University and his law degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was board director of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, past president of the Wisconsin Association with Criminal Defense Lawyers, and chair of the Wisconsin State's Bar Criminal Law Section. Mr. Buting, welcome in the show.
Thank you.
So, like I told you, it's a real pleasure to have you tonight. And I'm going to start the question with easy question. Don't be afraid. I know you can be impressed by me to be in life with Mr. Belgic, but don't worry. It will be it will be it will be cool. I would like to know first, start by the beginning. Where were you born, Jerry?
Indianapolis. Grew up there. Went to high school there. Went to college in Bloomington, Indiana at IU, and then to North Carolina for law school.
Oh, okay. So it is the same place where you grew up and you spent your youth.
Yes. Born and
Uh,
raised.
what was Jerome Buting like when he was 16, 17, 18 years old?
Well, it was the 70s. So,
Yeah.
growing up in high school in the 70s was pretty wild. There was the jocks, athletes. There were the um, what you used to call nerds, and probably all became billionaire tech entrepreneurs. And then there was sort of all the people in the middle, and I fit in that group of people, I guess. It was a Jesuit high school, all boys. Um, Went co-ed the year after I left, to my great chagrin. Um, but yeah, so that's there's lots of stuff going on in the 70s.
Yeah, a lot. And talking about your life, oh, and where did you meet your wife?
So my wife and I met actually on the very first day that we started as public defenders in the Milwaukee Trial Division office.
Really?
Yep, we were both
Oh,
brand new lawyers. We met and started the same day. She had gone to UW Madison for law school, and I came up from North Carolina, and we got to be good friends. We became intake court partners, where we would uh, basically spend all day working in court with people who had just been arrested, trying to get them out on bail. Um, and so we would take turns. They had bullpens in the courtroom. One of us would be back interviewing people, getting them ready. The other would be out in the courtroom. And um, my wife likes to say that I figured out early on that she was a morning person and I wasn't. So She would show up at 8 o'clock, and I knew she'd be there too, so I could show up about a half hour later because we couldn't both be in court at the same time. And I think she's accurate about that, actually.
About your family, do you have brother and sister?
Yes, I'm one of seven. Um, Two now deceased. But
Sorry.
yeah, so it was a big family. I was number three, which was kind of nice because I didn't have to break the ice on everything. I had two older brothers that would do that, um, and then my parents were distracted, shall we say, with the younger one. So I'd be kind of in the middle and could hide and get and be myself
Yeah.
without getting in too much trouble.
Yeah. And 20 years ago, and maybe a little bit more, but you have fight against cancer and you had a cancer surgery. Can you share with us what is like to be in this position?
Yeah, that was a big shock. So my wife and I married after 8 years of working together and as public defenders, and ultimately we tried cases together, homicides, sexual assaults, very serious stuff, and then fell in love, got married, had two children. Um, I left the public defender's office and started my own law firm by then. And so I guess I was about 44, 45 years old when suddenly they discovered I had this very rare cancer in my leg called a soft tissue sarcoma, which was rare and lethal. Um, and so there wasn't a lot of treatment options because if you get cancer, you don't want to get a rare one. Um,
Yeah.
there's not a lot of money in research, and so they try things that are used with other cancers. It was in my upper thigh. There was no pain. It was odd. It was just like a little bump that I thought
Yeah.
was nothing. And when I went in for a scan, it was as big as my hand
Oh.
inside my thigh. And the uh, the odd thing, the weird coincidental timing of all this was that I was meeting. So I'd had the scan, and um, the radiologist came out. If anybody's ever had a CT scan before, there's technicians in there, and the actual radiologist you never see. They're reading the stuff in the back, and they'll do a report, but you don't interact with them. Well, I knew it was bad news when I'm on the slab, and in walks the actual radiologist himself, and to say that there's a mass in there. It's large. I don't know if it's benign, but we need to get you over to a specialist orthopedic oncology surgeon. And so, as luck would have it, or not luck, but it's just coincidental timing of it, I was in his office with my wife on 9/11 when the planes hit. In fact, he was just telling us, he looked at the x-rays or CT scans. He said, I can tell you probably what this is. We're going to have to do a biopsy to be sure, but it is very likely the sarcoma, synovial cell sarcoma. You might lose your leg. We will try not to amputate. We try to save the limbs these days, but it's going to be a battle. You'll be probably off work for a year. And then he gets a page back in the day when they still had pagers. And he says, well, I'll let you guys talk for a minute. I'll be back. And when he came back in, he said that was my wife who told me that planes have just crashed into the World Trade Center.
Yeah.
And that's how we learned about that terrible tragedy, while we were also undergoing this personal tragedy. So he was right. I was off work for an entire year, and it was a battle. Anybody who's gone through a serious cancer knows exactly what I mean. I had chemo that was like battery acid. I mean,
Yeah.
it was awful. It was so toxic. I had to get it inpatient for a week. I couldn't just come in and out like for a day, or they had to do a very slow drip. And then of course I'd be terribly sick, and so I went through rounds of that, and then radiation. Um, Pretty much a lifetime dose of radiation to try and shrink it, or change the texture of it a little bit so that it would be easier to remove. Then I went through surgery, which was an unbelievable surgery, 13 and a half hours long, with teams of the orthopedic surgeon, and then the uh, cardio or vascular surgeons, because they had to tie off veins and reroute things because the tumor was surrounding stuff, and then they had to bring in a plastic guy to move muscles from my stomach down into this big cavity that was left in the leg. So it was an unbelievable amount of surgery that they did. When I
Yeah.
later learned it all, I was just amazed. And then I was in the hospital for a month, and probably half of that time was because of a mistake that was done at the hospital. They left a sponge in me. Go figure, a lawyer. Um, and it did not ever uh, become infected, but it spiked fevers every night. It took a while for them to figure it out for whatever reason, and then it delayed my recovery. But they saved my leg, they saved my life, and I'll be forever grateful to them. And then as I recovered after more chemo following the surgery, I had two cases that were pending to be argued in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And they postponed it while I was in treatment. And it's like the first day I go back to the office, somehow they found out, because I get this notice in the mail that both of them are set for oral argument now in like 3 weeks, one maybe a couple weeks apart or something. So I was right back into it. Um, and But I learned a lot, including for once I was in a position where I was dependent on experts, people that knew what they're doing. I got a little sense of what it must be like to be a client coming to me, depending on me to try and save their life, or at least years of their life,
Yeah.
um, and hoping that you've got the right lawyer, hoping you've got the right doctor. Um, and then I also learned about mistakes that can happen, and even in our medical system that is very advanced. There's mistakes, there's still a
Yeah.
human element, and that happens in with the best. Happens with
Yeah.
the best of
Absolutely.
doctors, happens with the best of lawyers. So I've taken some of those lessons with me, as I continued in my practice going forward.
Oh, thank you very much for sharing that with us and with the audience. Thank
Sure.
you, Jerry. Ned, it's on your turn.
Well, thank you so much, Jerome. Now, because we've been talking about Jerry's experience as a defense attorney, as I said during the intro, I host a segment called True Crime Talk Radio in the Morning. There's a similar segment on YouTube called Crime Talk, hosted by Scott Reich, who's a practicing defense attorney. And he made a claim that, Mr. Buting, I would like your response to.
Sure.
Every prosecutor secretly wants to be a defense attorney. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
I would disagree with that statement. I think there are some, and I'm biased, of course, but I think it's more of a challenge of your lawyer skills to be a defense attorney. Frankly, um, prosecutors, they deal with people who are very experienced witnesses all the time. That police officers. Um, they also have to deal with victims who are like defendants, rarely repeat people. They're usually the first time in the system. So, but a lot of the presentation of a case for a prosecutor is fairly standard. these are the elements you have to prove. These are the questions you ask, and you can't be leading. So it's like, okay, what if anything happened next, officer? And then they take it away from there. Whereas in the defense, you've got to build the whole case from new each time, and you don't have the kind of resources, no matter how wealthy your client is. You don't have the kind of resources to match the government that has an entire police force, crime labs behind them. But I would say that there are some prosecutors who are real crusaders for justice as they see it, crusaders for victims. And that's all good, fine and good, as long as they are fair and aren't trying to hide something or assist in some sort of illusion of justice rather than real justice. But there are some who I think really enjoy what they do not want to be a defense attorney, feel like their place in life and their certainly their career is on the prosecution side. But
All right, thank you. Very good answer.
Most of the time, though, I would say that you do see former prosecutors, in other words, lawyers leave the prosecutor's office and go into private practice. So you see them make that jump much more frequently than you see it the other way around. It's pretty rare. It's not unheard of. I know a few where a defense attorney changes and becomes a prosecutor. For whatever reason, that's much less common.
Wow, fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. About your book, what motivated you to write Legends of Justice? Was there a specific moment, as the Avery case or other case, that prompted you to share your experience?
Well, the whole book opportunity was unexpected, and I have been blessed with an amazing career with unbelievably interesting people, clients, and cases. Challenges, the Avery case was just one small part of it, quite frankly, especially before the documentary came out, which changed things quite a bit. But I'd had a lot of big cases, high profile cases, and very interesting cases that raised a lot of issues that just from talking to friends of mine, cocktail parties, non-lawyers, they would be always surprised at how the justice system really worked. Very different than what you see on TV. And so I had frankly always planned to do sort of a memoir book at some point, assuming it would be after I retire. And because I've got experience, I've got opinions, I've got things to say about what's wrong with the system and where I think it could improve. And then after Making a Murderer came out, the fame that came with that also gave me an opportunity to write the book then, and to get an advance to allow me to write the book while I was still working. And so that's what I did. I took advantage of that opportunity, and my book, Illusion of Justice, Inside America's Broken System, is just that. It's a little bit, there you go. It's a little bit of a memoir of me, and there's some stuff about my background, and the cancer, by the way, part is in the book, in large part because of the timing of that and the Avery case. I was just still recovering from that battle, and I was still getting scans every 3 months. Maybe I'd gone to 6 months when the Avery case came to me, and I had to make a decision whether I would take it, because it was a big obligation, and you never know. That's the problem with cancer, being a cancer patient. Every time you go in for a scan every 3 months or 6 months, is it going to be back? And are you going to be back in this roller coaster ride again. So,
Mhm.
so anyway, so that's in the book. So there's some memoir, personal stuff, but there's also discussion of not just the Avery case, but other cases I've had that raise similar issues that recur, in particular with forensic science, um, and the misuse of forensic science, which has always been sort of a pet uh, peeve of mine, a particular interest in forensic science.
Great. And in a way, we have you have answered to my next question, which was, do you have an idea to write another book one day? But you have answered to this question. So Ned, it's your
Yeah, I
turn.
mean, I might. I have other stories. I have other things to talk
Yeah.
about. Um, it probably will be when I retire, at this point, but I did enjoy writing it. I thought it was, and it was well received, and I really enjoyed the feedback I get from readers.
And how did the writing process go? Did you find it difficult to revisit such a high-profile case?
You know, the actually the Avery case helped. The high profile of it helped because
Yeah.
it was, by then there were websites that had uploaded all of the source documents. Not all the police reports, obviously not all the discovery that wasn't public, but by then the transcripts. And so I wrote a lot in the book while I was traveling, on planes, because I was going around speaking all over the world, and so I had deadlines I had to meet, and so I was able to access transcripts and things of that nature online while I was, remotely traveling. So that was useful. The the real blessing, I had a fabulous editor who, I didn't have any idea what it was like to write a book and what that process went through with the publisher. And um, I think editing, I thought, okay, somebody's going to do some copy editing and look for
Yeah.
a little bit of grammar or typos. But no, she was much better. She was much more comprehensive, and would take the some of the stories that I had, and reorder them in the book so that they flowed a little bit better, um, and ultimately I think made the product a whole lot better than I could have done on my own.
Great. Ned?
Yes, I have a two-part question. Mr. Buting, many of us first learn about you because of the documentary series Making a Murderer, and then secondarily because of your book, Illusion of Justice. And the two-part question is, number one, what was your immediate response to Making a Murderer coming out? And the second is, if there's something that you could change about that docu-series, what would it be?
All right, so no, none of us had any idea that this docu series would be such a hit. I actually was given an opportunity to watch, like a what really wasn't a preview. It was the completed docu series about a week or so before it came out, because I told them I wanted to be able to prepare my client. I wanted to be, I knew he was not going to be able to stream Netflix in prison, and so he wouldn't see it, at least not initially. I hoped at some point he would, but believe it or not, I think to this day he still has never seen it.
No.
Even though Netflix has offered to burn it onto a CD, and so that it could be played on a device in the prison, they won't do it. They won't allow it. But anyway, so I had watched it, with annoyingly my name, as a big watermark diagonally across the whole screen the entire time, 10 hours, and my name was misspelled. So two
True.
T's. So it was a little annoying, but looking past that, I knew that it was good. I thought it was very well done. And so I had that much of an advanced sense about what it was going to be like. But I had no idea it would become such a hit. And when it did, it was, suddenly it was actually what happened. I was in Italy 3 or 4. Well, let's see. It came out just before Christmas, which I thought was a ridiculous planning. This isn't a Christmassy movie. This is too depressing themes and topics to be around Christmas. But that's why Netflix is in marketing and not me. They knew
Yeah.
that between Christmas and New Year's, a lot of people are off work, and people binge watch. Especially, that was kind of new back then, but that's what they were. And so the timing of it really blew up over after Christmas. And 3 days after Christmas, I left to go to Italy for a vacation with my wife and daughter because my son was studying in Rome and could not come home. And so, Netflix wanted me to stay because things were blowing up, but I wasn't going to give up my family vacation for that. By the way, some people may not know this, but I was never paid by Netflix. Nobody was ever paid by Netflix that's in that docuseries, other than the producers who created it and put it together. So I didn't have any kind of financial obligation to be there. But so I go to Rome, and I'm there for about 10 days or 2 weeks, and I'm following my online what's happening. My email box is blowing up. My Twitter account is going up by 1,000 people a day, and I could see that it was on the news online, but I was walking around Rome and nobody recognized me. It was it didn't Italy didn't was just getting Netflix at the time. In fact, I remember walking down the street and going past some like window of maybe TV station or something that had an ad for Netflix, and right there was Stephen Avery's picture, and making a murder, but nobody was watching it. So when I came back, though, it was unbelievable. I mean, I got off the plane. I agreed to be routed back through New York on my way home so that they wanted me to do some morning shows and TV appearances. So I did that, and they said, "Oh, you're not going to believe it. When you get off the plane, you're going to be like George Clooney." I said, "There's no way." I mean, because nobody even recognized me, but they were right. Yeah, I got off the plane. I didn't get one gate in the airport before people started coming up to me, Jerry, Jerry. They knew my name, and so that was very awkward. Immediately being thrown into that, and then within a few weeks, the special prosecutor in the case, started pushing back and claiming that the docuseries was biased and that the state had all this powerful evidence that wasn't included. And it just wasn't. It is not true. It wasn't then. It still isn't true. There was the trial was 6 weeks. The docuseries was 10 hours.
Yeah.
But within that time, I mean, there was something like 3.5 to 4 hours of actual courtroom footage where you would hear what the witnesses were asked, you'd hear what they say, what they looked like. And of course, there's editing. You have to edit it down. But when it comes to the primary pieces of evidence and issues that both sides fought over, they really covered both sides. You would see the closing argument, you would see the question, the comments we make, you would see the special prosecutor's response back and forth. So, there was some evidence that was left out, both from the prosecution side and the defense. There's some things that I would have liked to see more of. Now, you asked if there was one thing I would have liked to see different in the docuseries.
Yes.
I guess when we agreed to cooperate with them, we thought the prosecution was also working with them, and in fact, they offered, or they asked, the producers asked the prosecution to participate, um, and I think that it would have been nice to see not only behind the scenes, so you get more of a defense flavor probably, because we were giving them behind the scene access, not interviews. That's not the way they put it together, but we would be brainstorming, working on the case, preparing during the trial, before the trial, and they'd have, we would let them come and set up cameras in the corner, and they would just sit there and film us. And I think it would have been a little bit richer experience to see the prosecution doing the same thing, but they refused to do that. And you do see there are more docuseries that, and certainly television shows that present the prosecution side, and either fictionalized or real. There's very little that shows the defense side,
Yeah.
and I think that was one of the enduring things that came out of this docuseries, was that people started to understand why defense attorneys are needed, why we're important in the system. You have to have that balance, and so. But other than that, I mean, I think the docuseries was very well done, and you know, um, fairly presented the key pieces of evidence that people fought about.
About your role in as defense counsel, uh, what is the biggest lessons you have learned from the defense in complex case like Stephen Avery?
Well, I don't know that there's one lesson. When you do a big complex case that has high profile, and that's probably there's a different aspect you have to deal with when a case is high profile, and um, a lot of attorneys will say no comment. They don't want to speak about the case at all. But um, I've never believed that. I think that I understand the media has a job to do. They're going to do a story. If your case is in court and it's a big enough case, they're going to do a story about it, and they're going to present their side. So if there's something that the defense can say that's ethically allowed, I think you should say it, because the story's going to run anyway. And even
Yeah.
if it sometimes just means it's a reminder to the viewing public that, hey, this case, this defendant is presumed innocent, and you don't know all the facts. Very early in the case, even I don't know all the facts. And when we first got on the Avery case, we did not know all the facts. Um, so I think that handling a high-profile case is different. I had done it before Avery, so that helped. Um, there were some odd things in that case that are not typical, which are daily. We had daily press conferences during the trial. I've never done that before or since. Um, and that came about because the prosecution is the one that agreed to do it,
Yeah.
and had already made arrangements where they were going to do alternate days. Every other day was going to be um, the victim's brother, and then the special prosecutor. And we're like, wait a minute, that's every day you're presenting the state's case, because he's obviously, all he's heard is your side, and he thinks that your side is the truth. So um, we agreed the compromise would be that both sides would give press conferences, limited questions, short length of time, every day at the end of the trial, but that we would only talk about what had happened that day. We were not allowed to talk about evidence that was still coming,
Yes, I
um,
know.
or uh, really evidence that didn't come in. Partly that was because the jurors were not sequestered. They were told not to watch television or news, but we know that they do. Many of them, some of them stick to it. Maybe even most of them stick to their oath. But there are every high profile case I've had, we found a juror who doesn't do that, who's watching the news and hearing. Sometimes it's there are legal battles about evidence that take place outside the presence of the jury for very good reasons, and yet they're covered on the news, and then jurors who are in a case will see it, and it's entirely improper. So we tried to limit that possibility in these press conferences by only talking about evidence that had already happened in the trial and answering questions from the media about those kinds of things.
Which lead to my other question: how do you deal with media pressure in general and public coverage during an high-profile case?
Well, one of the things we did at the very beginning, and this was my co-counsel Dean Strang's idea, was that we would only respond to the media through emails. We weren't going to take phone calls interrupting us all day long. If they wanted to talk to us, it had to be through an email where we could answer it on our schedule. And, we were cognizant of the fact that media has deadlines. They've got to get a story out by such and such a date, a time of the day, if it's going to be on television or whether it's going to be, in the newspaper as well. There are deadlines. And so we would try and be as accommodating as we could with them, but we simply were not going to take, the kind of phone calls that would interrupt our work all day long. So that was, I guess, one way to deal with it. As it happened, the judge imposed sort of a gag order on the attorneys, but it was after the special prosecutor had done this incredibly poisoning and false press conference describing Brendan Dassey's confession that was completely false.
On March 3rd.
Yeah. In fact, that's the day I got on the case. And so, he gives this press conference, and, supposedly this bloody, horrific torture, rape, murder occurred. And yet, at the very time he's given that press conference, they already knew, the state knew, because the crime lab had already done all these tests, that there was no evidence to support it. There was not a shred of evidence of Teresa Halbach's blood or DNA anywhere in Stephen Avery's bedroom or anywhere inside of his residence. And one of the other things that happened was that as a result of Brendan's confession, they added some charges, sexual assault, false imprisonment, to Stephen Avery's case. And then the judge increased the bail because of that, because these were, now there's this horrible torture, rape, facts that go along with it. And so he increased the bail. Well, about a month or so later is when we finally got the crime lab reports, and the crime lab reports proved it wasn't just a possibility. They proved that there was no evidence to support it. And by then we were also getting the videos of Brendan Dassey's confession, which, I knew when I heard it that it was false. It was, it had all the hallmarks of the kinds of false confessions I'd already seen in my career. And so we filed a bail motion to have the judge understand some of this evidence and try and present the other side. But it never made it into the court file. It sat on the judge's desk. So, once it was filed, unless the court ordered it sealed, then the media would have had the other side. They would have seen, well, wait a second, maybe this press conference really isn't the truth. but that never happened. And so when we went to trial, the only version of what happened or didn't happen was that press conference where the state relayed this false confession from Brendan Dassey. So when the trial started and we started pointing out through our cross-examination all of these things that didn't happen, the media was really stunned. The reporters would come to us like, "Wow, it's a whole different case than we thought. It's a close case. This is going to be a battle." Uh, so, but I don't know if that answers your question, but that's
Yes.
that's the way we tried to handle the kind of hoopla that you get in a high-profile case like that.
And my last question, before going the mic to Ned, how do you see the role of the defense lawyer in a system where the public has often already take side even before the trial?
Where they're already what? Decided?
Yeah.
Well, again, there are limitations on what lawyers can do ethically. There's a built-in imbalance in the system because law enforcement often does perp walks deliberately, where they will, dress the guy in orange, or in Stephen Avery's case, the black and white prisoner garb, and have chains on his hands and his legs, and then walk him past or her past the cameras. And the very deliberate message is, we got the right guy, and he's so dangerous, we need to chain him up like an animal. And that's the image that's being given to the public about somebody when they were first charged. I remember seeing a case where, this woman was like, I don't know, 8 months pregnant, and this was in a different state, and and they did a perp walk of her in chains through past the cameras, as if somehow this 8-month-old pregnant woman is going to be able to flee with law enforcement around her if they didn't put chains on her. So anyway, this stuff is deliberately done. And then the next thing that happens is a criminal complaint or indictment is issued, and they are one-sided. They present only the evidence the state wants them to present. And then the media picks up on that. And so the very first version that the public hears is, they got the right guy. And this is what happened. This is the truth. When it's only one version of what happened, and very often not the truth. And so then sometimes the media interest fades in a case, and so the public really doesn't hear anything more until the trial. And under that environment, it is difficult to get fair jurors, particularly in a really high-profile case like the Avery case. That was statewide coverage. Every single county, people were seeing this over and over and over. Every single time there was any kind of court appearance, they would, replay the horrible facts that were alleged in the press conference from this false confession of Brendan Dassey.
Brendan,
Yeah. So, but defense attorney can't call a press conference and say, "Hey, this is what the evidence is going to show." And prosecutors aren't supposed to either. They have their own rules.
Yeah.
And that it limits and they are not supposed to talk about a confession, for instance. I mean, that right there is ethically barred. The problem, though, and that didn't happen here. Kratz, the special prosecutor, gave an unbelievably detailed, gruesome description of the confession, so-called. And but even when a prosecutor doesn't do that, the rules of ethics only apply to lawyers. They don't apply to cops. And how many times have you seen the police chief come to a podium and surround him or herself with all these other people who've been working on the case, and I want to introduce Lieutenant so and so, and and they present their whole story, again polluting the potential jury pool, and the way the courts deal with that is completely inadequate. It's You can file a change of venue and ask to have either the whole entire trial moved or bring in jurors from a different county. But in this day and age, with social media coverage of often false information, as well as all the the mainstream media coverage, it's very hard to find in a high
Yeah.
profile case anybody who hasn't heard or seen anything about it. And so what courts should do in those cases is really take the time, the whole part of jury selection. A lot of parts of the world, they don't have juries. Belgium, for instance, does not have jury trials.
No.
And a lot of people who don't have them think it's ridiculous that we have jury trials. These people are biased and they're amateurs, or they're just plain stupid sometimes, and they should be abolished. We should have only courts deciding, particularly these big serious cases. And that's unfortunate. That's never going to happen in America because we have a constitutional right to a jury trial, and I can't see that ever going away. Um, but it's not really so much the fact that we have juries that's the problem. The problem is judges don't take the time that's necessary to really ferret out those people who can't be fair. Those
Yeah.
people who've heard, you're looking for people that if they've heard something about the case, they can truly, honestly put it aside and understand that what they hear in the media is not necessarily the real evidence about what happened, and decide the case only on what's presented in court. So judges, should really spend time in the jury selection process trying to identify those people who really have a bias. We all have biases, and
Yeah.
most of them are unconscious. But we have to be able to examine them ourselves and look inside and say, can we really be a good juror in this kind of case? Maybe there's another case we'd be a great juror in, but this one's not right for me. Judges should encourage that kind of dialogue from jurors, but instead they intimidate them.
Yeah.
If somebody says, well, I don't know if I could be fair, I really, I've heard too much about this case, and the judge's first response is this, like, out of fear that they're going to run out of jurors if they start laying people off, perhaps. But they'll say, well, you understand that that's not the law, and I'm going to instruct you that you have to do this, that, and the other thing. And, will you follow the instructions? And, judges are authority figures. Most people don't want to say, no, I'm not going to follow your instructions, Judge. Some do. Some say, Judge, I just can't. And that's a good, honest answer.
Yeah.
But those jurors then are struck, and the ones who can't really don't have the wherewithal or the ability to resist that kind of pressure sometimes end up on juries when they shouldn't be.
Great. I agree 100%. Ned?
And yes, we are live now, and there is actually a question in the chat that is one that I want to ask. Fire Pixie and I were thinking the same thing. Now, the victim in Making a Murderer is Teresa Halbach, and of course, the docuseries was made because a lot of people question Stephen Avery's guilt or his innocence. And Jerry, you wrote some of this in your book, Illusion of Justice, when you were talking about the scenarios that could have played out. However, the question is, what do you truly think happened to Teresa Halbach?
And the honest answer is I don't know. And the sad corollary to that is we probably will never know all of it because evidence was destroyed or not obtained by law enforcement when it should have been. When you have a laser focus on one suspect and only one suspect, and you therefore ignore other possible scenarios and suspects, then you're going to miss a lot. And what happens is, when it comes particularly to witnesses that need to be interviewed, well, in this case, there's witnesses that weren't interviewed or weren't interviewed properly by law enforcement, because they're the ones that can do it. The defense, um, in most states in America, we don't have depositions. A deposition is where you can subpoena somebody to come answer questions under oath before you get to the actual trial. Often it's in law offices, and there's a court reporter taking down everything. But if you don't have something like that, then you have no way to make witnesses talk. And in truth, neither do the police. But they have this authority that when they approach somebody, they're gonna. Most people will cooperate and will give statements, providing information that could be valuable clues that go one way or the other. In this case, they didn't do that. And a lot of the questions about what happens in a homicide involve people that are something like 95% of homicides of a woman are committed by some man who is close to that woman in her sphere of life. Friends, spouses, partners, co-workers, things like that. Boyfriend, ex-boyfriends, husbands, ex-husbands. That's just statistically the truth. And by the time someone's charged, like Stephen Avery, the people that knew Teresa Halbach and may have had valuable information that we would have loved to obtained would not talk to us. And that's common. You're wait a minute, you're representing who? The guy that is accused of killing my friend or my daughter or whatever. The door is slammed in your face. So there are things about her life that there's nothing scandalous, I don't think, but there are things about her life and who she knew and where she went and who she associated with that have never come out, because the police never asked anyone about it, including her family members, or if they did, they never wrote it down. And so, and then there's crucial physical evidence that was destroyed. When those bones were found, wherever they were found, there was never any pictures taken of them the way they looked. And we made an issue of this at trial. It's one of the things that wasn't covered that much from the defense perspective in Making a Murderer. But the condition of those bones that were supposedly found in the fire pit were crucial, because from our standpoint, if the evidence showed that those bones had been moved to Stephen Avery's burn pit from somewhere else, then that was strong evidence, frankly conclusive in my mind, that Stephen Avery was innocent. Because, as I said, nobody is going to burn a body somewhere else, bring their cremains and dump them on your own property. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And had they taken, recovered those bones, if they ever were really in the burn pit, there's doubts about that because there's never a picture. But if they had done their job properly, and documented photographically and with an anthropologist at the scene, then we would have a better answer of that question, because there often might be, if a body is dumped somewhere, then everything's going to be jumbled up. Whereas if a body is burned at a particular location and that is where the primary site was, you might often find bones that are, contiguous to each other, um, anatomically, where you would expect to find them. So none of that was preserved, and it can't be recreated in any way at this point. So to answer the question, though, I don't know. I don't have an answer for people. I have theories, as do lots of people who've not just looked at the documentary, but gone much, much deeper. There are people who've read through all of the transcripts from the entire trial and pre-trial, and much more than that, crime lab reports, police reports that have been obtained through open records now. And, lots of people have a lot of different theories about it. But, my fear is that we're never going to know really what happened to her. But having said that, that should not be required in order for Stephen Avery to get a new trial.
No.
It should not be his burden to solve the case. It's not his burden to solve the case at the beginning of the trial. And at this point, if he's able to demonstrate, as he's trying to do through Kathleen Zellner, that there are serious questions that the jury didn't know about and evidence that wasn't presented originally, then he should be allowed to do that without having to solve the case.
And I do have to throw in one follow-up there. And you touched upon it, but some people in the chat are even asking, and it's something that I wanted to ask you too, because I think it's the question that is on everybody's mind. Was Stephen Avery guilty, in your opinion?
No, in my opinion, he was not. I'm not God. Only God would know, and Stephen Avery. But based on my experience, and I've done many homicides. I've been practicing law for over 40 years now, and the evidence just did not fit in this case. It's on the one hand, they want to try and portray Stephen Avery as this criminal mastermind, and immaculate cleaner up of crime scenes, to explain why they don't have the evidence that they should have. But on the other hand, they say that he took the key to the RAV4 and put it in his bedroom in plain sight right on the floor, where the cops are going to find it, days later after he had already been visited by Sergeant Colbert.
7 times.
Yeah. And so it's just ridiculous to say that he would have left the evidence that they say he did leave, but not leave all this other evidence that should have been there if he really killed her. So, nor has he ever, from the day he was arrested, his every communication with people has been recorded. And frankly, I think some of the attorney-client communications that we had before trial were recorded. And, most people are going to slip if they're guilty. They're going to say something to somebody, that's just human nature. That's not happened with Stephen Avery, because I don't believe he's guilty of this crime.
Okay, thank you so much.
And I do agree 100% with you, Jerry. I don't think he's guilty at all. And I have working on this case for 7 years, and I don't have changed my mind. And same for Brandon. In your book, A Legend of Justice, great book. I recommend you. You can find it on Amazon. You talk about systemic bias. What reform do you propose to correct this bias in the American judicial system?
Well, I've talked about one of them, which is we have to just recognize, first of all, that we're human beings, and this is a system that's run by human beings, and we're going to have biases,
Yeah.
and that we need to really do a better job when we get to the point of picking jurors. The lawyers, I mean, there are many places where the courts, even in serious cases, the courts will not allow the attorneys to ask any questions of the prospective jurors. There's no attorney-directed voir dire. Instead, the judge will ask the questions, and often, and that's true in the entire federal system, with a few, case-by-case exceptions where a judge might grant limited attorney-conducted voir dire. But most of the time, in those scenarios, the best you can do is submit questions and say, Judge, I want you to ask these people this. But then the way they ask it is not the way it really should be asked. It's or there's no follow-up the way it should be, and so you don't really have a chance to explore and find out the people who are biased. Some countries that do have juries, Canada, for instance, they basically just pick the first 12 people they can get. I mean, it's very close to that. And, there's some people who feel that, you're not any worse off just randomly picking people than spending the time to try and do it. But I've never agreed with that. I do think that there are some people who are just better suited for a particular jury trial than others, and some who particularly are not suited. Somebody who has close family member or good friend who's experienced a traumatic crime, or maybe is a crime victim themselves. You can't just say you're disqualified. Anybody who's ever been a victim of a crime cannot ever sit on a jury. It's not necessary, really. But people have to be able to put it aside. And some people, if you've got a case that is factually similar to some trauma they experienced, they're not going to be a good, fair juror. They're going to be harkening back to what they experienced. And they might be a great juror in some other kind of a charge, some other kind of a case. So that's one of the things. The other thing is that people have to try and be, they've got to be involved in the jury system. I say this in the book. One of the things that when people get a jury summons, it's like, oh no, God, I don't want to go. It's like, it's like they're getting a root canal. I mean, it's that bad. People do whatever they can to get out of jury service, and they really shouldn't, because it's a civic duty. It's the only time that Americans ever get a chance to participate in the judicial branch of our three-branch government. They are actually deciding the facts as jurors, and it's a burden on people when it's a long trial, in particular. But it's a civic duty that if people continue to try and avoid it all, then you end up with. I've had many jury pools where I walk in and it's all very young people who are 18, 19, 20, still in school, and don't have jobs that impact their ability to be there, or retired people. But there's this huge swath of people in the middle that are raising children and have their own businesses, and it's difficult for them to take off time. We don't pay much of anything for people to serve on jurors. Some employers, even though the law says they have to allow people to be to serve as jurors if they get summoned, that there's other little ways they can make it difficult for them. So that would go a long way if we broadened the pool of people who were actually appearing in court for or as prospective jurors. And we also, as consumers of the media, we've got to do a better job of trying to keep an open mind and not just rush to judgment. It's very difficult in this day of instant social media misinformation on both sides. Politically, we see it all the time. The misinformation is polarized us as a nation. But you see it also, of course, in criminal cases. Someone gets charged, and that's posted on Facebook, and you look at the comments, and these people have made up their mind. They don't know any of the facts. They've heard just one little version of what the police say happened, and they've already made up their minds. You
True.
can't, you really shouldn't do that. People need to be more educated. They have to also understand the perp walk. Those should be banned. We should not allow police officers. Sometimes they will call the media, not always, but there are instances where they'll call the media and say, "Hey, we're going to be walking this guy, down the hall or out the back door to the cars. If you want to be there." And then, of course, they're there. It's like this is their photo op. So people who see that on TV have to stop and think, why are they doing that? If their case is that strong, why are they trying to rig the system by biasing people, scaring people into thinking this person's a dangerous man or woman who has to be in chains? So that helps. The other thing, I don't know that I would call it bias so much as it's just human nature, pressure. We should not elect judges ever, anywhere. It's a bad idea. Many states in America do not. Most of the rest of the world does not. The problem you get is it becomes too political for that individual judge, particularly in a smaller community.
Yeah.
A big urban area, city of Milwaukee, a judge can hear the facts, understand, for instance, that a search was improper or a confession was coerced, and they can make a ruling throwing it out, keeping it out of court without any repercussions. But when you're in a small county, the judge who handled Brendan Dassey's case, people, how could that come in? Well, if he had thrown that confession out and said that it was coerced, he would not only lose the support of the law enforcement next time he ran for election, they probably would have drafted somebody to run against him. And judges are supposed to be able to put that aside and say, we have to follow the law, not our own personal beliefs or feelings or pressures. But it's just an impossible task for some people, and we shouldn't ask them to do it. Why do we ask judges to have to face that moral quandary of, I either follow the law and get booted out of office, or don't follow the law so I can stay in office? It's completely unfair and rigged. So if there was one thing we could do here that would really help, it would be to get rid of all judicial elections. And the states that have done it, they use merit panels that pick judges on merit and submit a list, and then ultimately the governor decides. Some of them that have retention elections, so it's not like the person's on for life. They may have to appear before the electorate later once they've already got a record, and that's not the greatest either, because that again leaves politics into it. But it's better than what we have now.
Absolutely. Ned?
Well, I know Jerry has some time constraints now, and how much time do you have, Jerry, for any more future questions? Or
A little while. I can't follow the comments, but I don't know if there's any other questions in there you'd want to address.
You are going to watch it that later. Don't worry.
Okay.
Don't worry.
yes,
Uh,
and I do have
Go
one
ahead.
final question though, and that is that do you believe that the conviction of Brendan Dassey was either unjust, incorrect, or he should have been found not guilty based on reasonable doubt?
The jury, when it came to his trial, frankly, the jury did not know all of the evidence. Um, the jury was not, for instance, they never even heard or saw the part of his interrogation session when he first has contact with the outside world. His mother comes in, and he immediately starts recanting, saying they got to my head, and they also used a part of this ridiculous third interrogation that was allowed by his own lawyer, who refused to come and protect his 16-year-old client who's charged with the most serious crime, facing life in prison. He allowed his client to be interviewed without being there, and in fact did it after he had hired this private investigator who tried to coerce Brendan into confessing and flipping to testify against his uncle. And so then that next morning, they didn't use the actual interrogation itself, which really got them nothing, because Brendan was completely inconsistent. This is a May 13th interview, I think it was, because he didn't know what happened. He wasn't involved at all. He was, in my view, completely innocent. But when it comes to the jury's decision in that case, they didn't really have all the evidence they needed. They didn't have lawyers who properly explained to the jury how false confessions occur. They had a prosecutor who, without objection, got up in front of that jury and said, innocent people don't confess. When, frankly, that prosecutor knew better himself, personally knew of cases where people do falsely confess. And
It's the pattern. Yeah.
and exoneration studies have shown that particularly when it's involving juveniles, who have later been completely proven innocent by DNA most of the time, 40% of them confessed to crimes they didn't do. And so, that's what the jury's hearing. The jury heard that. The jury didn't hear other evidence that the jury didn't. Most people, it is a hard hurdle to get over, the idea that people falsely confess, because most people who would sit on a jury say, I would never confess. If I didn't do something, I would never admit it. Why? Why? And but they're not the person who's sitting in the room alone with detectives, who very often has mental limitations or challenges, and they're not up against cops who get trained, expertly how to manipulate people and get them to say things, and feed facts to them like they did to Brendan Dassey. So the jury really didn't get I don't think he got a fair trial. I think it was, I think the federal courts understood that. State courts didn't. He then went on federal habeas, and the first federal judge who wrote a 90-page opinion was convinced that this was a involuntary coerced confession, explaining it all. And then the state appealed. There was a 3-judge panel, and 2 of those 3 judges agreed. One of them even said, watching this interrogation makes your skin crawl to see what they did to this young man. But then it got appealed yet again to what was supposed to be a full panel of all of the judges sitting in the Seventh Circuit. But as luck would have it, because politically we were in a gridlock, Obama had none of his judges were being approved as appointed to the bench at that time. And the Seventh Circuit had 3 vacancies. So there was more even. There were only 7 judges. There's supposed to be 11 or 12 even. I think 11 back then. And so there was only 7 judges, and they reversed it 4-3. So yeah, I mean, he did not get a fair shake. The governor could still step in, has not. I don't know why, other than it's political, which of course the clemency decision always is. But this governor said that he would do something to try and reduce the overcrowding and the mass incarceration that we've done in our state. That was how he was first elected. That was a part of his campaign promise, and he really has not. He's done very little to reduce the overcrowding, and his pardon requirements, clemency requirements, would completely exclude someone like Brendan or anybody who's still in prison, because you have to be out of prison for 5 years and staying out of trouble, of course, in order to meet the criteria that he has decided. And it's his prerogative. He can establish those kinds of guidelines or criteria, but it does absolutely nothing to help people like Brendan or the many, many other people who are wrongly convicted sitting in prison to this day. And you see that all over the country. Let me just finish with this. When it comes to wrongful convictions, people have tried to academics and sociologists have tried to estimate how many people are wrongly convicted. Most cases don't have DNA evidence that proves it one way or the other. It's not a biologically based evidence case, and so they can't prove their innocence with DNA like people who have with exoneration cases. But there's been estimates that as many as 8% there are 2 million people imprisoned in America. 2 million. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. America has 5% of the population globally in the world, and yet we have 20% of the incarcerated individuals in this world are right here in America. 20%. And so the estimates have ranged from 1% to 8%. Even at 1% of that's 20,000 wrongly convicted people sitting in prison. And we exonerate to the highest maybe is about 150 a year. We're never going to get to 20,000, and it's partly because we make it so very, very difficult for somebody to get a fair shake and to get a new trial, have their case looked at again once they've been convicted. And we see that in Stephen Avery's case, illustrated glaringly, where hundreds of pages of affidavits and legal arguments have been presented for at least to have a hearing to see whether or not any of the evidence that Kathleen Zellner has accumulated is credible. But he cannot even get a hearing, and it's outrageous. If let's hear. I don't know the witnesses. I'm not involved. I'm not representing him at this time, so I can't say that all these witnesses she's accumulated are credible. But bring them into court and let the state cross-examine them and point out their weaknesses or their lack of credibility if they can show it. But to not even have a hearing is just outrageous, and I think it's. They're afraid of the publicity that would result. have a hearing and have to, be a deluge of media covering it. And the state desperately wants to avoid that. And so far, they've been able to convince the judges as well.
Okay,
Hopefully,
and oh, excuse me. I thought you were finished, sir. Sorry. But just to throw one follow-up to that, I found that there are two major either beliefs or observations that people have about Brendan Dassey's confession. Number one is that he was coerced by the police. They were putting so much pressure on him that he admitted to it. And the second one is that he admitted to it because he didn't understand what he was confessing to. And I'm going to be careful with my language because I don't want to say anything bad about Brendan Dassey. But what I mean by that is that he thought that even if he were punished for this, it wouldn't be a severe punishment. He made a comment such as, well, I get to go home for WrestleMania, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Which one of those do you think it is, or do you think it's something different? Do you think it's a combination of both about what would what would be pressuring Brendan Dassey to confess to this crime if he didn't do it?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. In fact, the studies of wrongful conviction show that there's two aspects of it. One is the questioning technique that can be coercive, and the other is the individual to whom it's or to which it's applied. So if that person is vulnerable to suggestion or coercive psychological techniques, then it's more likely to result in a false confession. And you see that with young people. That's why I said 40% of juveniles falsely confessed when they later were proven innocent by DNA, because they are more vulnerable to these kinds of questioning techniques, as are other vulnerable adults. People have mental challenges and mental limitations that make them easy targets for these sophisticated cops to get what they want. And what they want in every case is a confession. It makes their case so much easier.
Yeah.
Whether it's the truth or not, not every interrogator is corrupt and trying to get a false confession. What often happens is, they have tunnel vision themselves. They have cognitive bias. They believe this person's guilty, and so they try and coerce a confession to support that belief rather than really being fair and keeping an open mind. And again, it's a lot of it is questioning techniques. The Reed technique in America,
Yeah.
that is still widely used, is banned in many other parts of the country, or the world, I should say. And in fact, in the UK, for instance, they've used a completely different approach for a couple decades now. And originally, it was felt like, oh, we're not going to be able to get really guilty people to talk to us with this technique, but that hasn't proven to be the case at all. They've been as successful in investigating cases as this other technique, with a lower rate of false confessions. The Reed technique has the highest rate of any kind of technique, short of actual torture, I suppose. But the techniques they use are psychologically very, very sophisticated. So in Brendan's case, it was a combination. I mean, clearly in the middle of the interrogation, they leave the room for a little bit and he comes back. Now, by that point, he has already admitted to the rape, torture, murder, and mutilation of Teresa Halbach. And they take a break and he comes back and he's like, how much longer are we going to be? And they said, why? Well, because I have a project due in 5th period. I'd like to try and get back to school. Like, he thinks at that point, he really thinks he's going to go back to school. And, they took advantage of that weakness in him. He was a soft, easy target for that kind of technique. And so it was a combination of his limitations to be able to stand up to their techniques and the technique they used.
Yes, and it's really outrageous when you see this 5.5 hour of confession, let's say confession, but yeah, it's really horrible. To, and I have again two, let's say, normal question. After I have just little funny question, but during this time, that could you watch in the chat if there is some question for? But my first question,
There's a lot. There's over 100. It's hard. That's
yeah,
when I'm answering
okay,
questions, I can't really follow them. I'm sorry. Sorry, people.
I can
no,
pull one out.
no, don't be sorry. I would like to go about your job itself. What aspect of defense lawyer's job, as you describe in your book, are often misunderstood by the general public?
Well, I think the biggest thing is people are like the most common question I get at like a cocktail party or something is, how do you defend those people? Um,
Hmm,
and
okay,
even in the question, there's a clue there that when you describe someone who's been accused of the crime as those people, um, then the questioner unwittingly is already separating him or herself from them and
yeah,
making them someone who's other than them,
yeah,
when in fact many times they are just like them. They could be their brother or
yes,
son or husband.
could
um,
happen to everyone. Yeah,
right. And so that's right away there's a problem with the question. But um, what they're really asking is, how can I how do I live with myself representing people like that? Um, Guilty people is what they're thinking in their own minds. And the honest truth is, you talk to any criminal defense lawyer, um, it's easier to represent somebody who is guilty than it is somebody who's innocent. That is the weight of the world and their entire life is on your shoulders when you're representing somebody you truly believe is innocent. Now, you don't often, or I should say, sometimes you don't know. But the truth of the matter is, most people who are guilty admit it and have already, in fact, admitted it and confessed before I ever get on the case. Uh, so the question, though, is what happens? You know, um, what happens to that person who has committed a crime? Should their entire life be judged by one day that they had, or sometimes a period in their life when they're young, and it's often fueled by drugs, alcohol, and um, and youth and impulsive behavior. So what what is the appropriate punishment? What I need to try and do in my job is stop the factory line, assembly line of so-called justice, where we're grinding up people, mostly poor, in court, coming through. Judges don't even know their names half the time. In fact, some of the lawyers don't even know their client's name or what they look like. They call them out. Mr. So and so, are you here? Because they're so overworked. It's like an assembly line. And what a defense attorney needs to do is slow that down, let the prosecutor and judge know that their client is a human being. Here's what's going on with him or her. Um, this isn't all just what you see. They did, if they in fact are guilty, is not all that you need to know about them. And you don't need to throw away their entire lives like they're a piece of trash. The kinds of sentences, one of the reasons we have so many people incarcerated in America is our sentences are unbelievably long. Judges hand out 25, 30, 40, 50-year sentences like nothing. And in a lot of states like Wisconsin, when they say 25 or 50 years, they mean you're going to do all that time. You're not. There is no parole. They've
no,
abolished it. So it, you know, if people understand, the vast majority of crime occurs and during a certain age group, 15, 16, 17-year-olds to 25-year-olds, particularly when it comes to males. And we now know that there's science that explains that. Their brains are still developing. The impulse control part of their brain is not fully functioned in some people, but they will grow out of that. And so, we don't need to take a 20-year-old and lock them up for 45 years. By the time that person is 30, he's talking to me saying, hey, I see these young guys coming in here and they don't have a clue. God, I wish I could talk to myself when I was 20. This would never happen. So, you know, instead of giving 25 years, we should be giving 5 years
Yeah.
to people. So anyway, so my job is like any criminal defense lawyer's job, is to try and humanize the defendant, if they don't like to call anything but the defendant. And, if they're guilty, try and let the punishment and the charge fit what they did.
Yeah.
And if they're not guilty, try and make the system work when it's so broken. It's a challenge in every single case to try and get the jury to acquit, if at all possible.
Which lead to my final question, let's say serious question. If you had the power to reform part of the justice system, where would you start?
Well, I think I talked a little bit about this already, which is, there's the way we select juries,
Yeah.
the way we select judges.
Yeah.
Elections are terrible. Those
Yeah.
are the biggest. And the one thing I haven't talked much about is the lack of transparency in the process. Defense attorneys, I did say we don't have a right to deposition. There's a few states, Florida, Iowa, I think, maybe one other, where you can do depositions, but by and large you can't. And so you come into court and you've got police reports, maybe you've got a crime lab report, maybe some lab sheets if you ask for them. But when it comes to really being prepared, you're relying on them having turned over what they should. There's a Brady rule that says that a prosecutor has to disclose any potentially exculpatory evidence, but there's no mechanism to prove that. There's no way to force prosecutors to do that. Some of them are corrupt and hide evidence deliberately. More of them are not like that, but they don't see how evidence they withhold is relevant and important to the defense, because they're not looking at it through the advocate's eyes of a defense attorney. And so it doesn't seem material to them, and so it's not disclosed. And I'll close with this one last thing, which is the forensic science. I'm speaking to forensic scientists next week. I like doing that because I like to try and encourage them to apply real science in the courtroom, not junk science, and to admit to the limitations of their science. Most forensic evidence is the state tries to make it conclusive to decide the cases. Jurors wish that it's conclusive because they watch CSI or NCIC or Bones or things on television that make it look like the case can always be solved, proven through forensic science, and that's just not the case.
No.
It's a piece of the puzzle. It can be supportive evidence if there's incriminating trace evidence or whatnot, but it's rarely conclusive evidence of guilt. even when it comes to DNA these days, because this is the odd thing about DNA. It has become so sensitive. Back in the day when it first was devised, you had to have a lot of blood at a scene or a lot of
Yeah.
semen that would match a defendant, or fit the profile of a defendant. But nowadays these tests are so sensitive that they can get an entire person's DNA profile in just a few cells. And what that has done is it means that now, um, the fact that someone's DNA is found on a doorknob at the house where this crime was committed, um, may be less probative. It may have no probative value because there's touch DNA and transfer. It's so easy for us to transfer small amounts of DNA when we're not even at the scene. I could shake your hand, you could go off and rob a bank, leave a gun behind, and my DNA is on that gun that I never touched because they can find these tiny, tiny little amounts. So, so when it comes to all forensic evidence, including DNA, we really need to step back and take the pressure off those forensic scientists to try and solve the case, and let them have the independence to say, this is what the science shows. This is what I did. I followed these tests, protocols, and can I say that there's that this bullet came from this gun and no other gun in the world? No, I cannot say that. Nobody should say that, but supposed experts actually do say that all the time. Allow them to admit to the limitations of their science and their test methodologies, and say that this is just a piece of the puzzle that you can consider. It is, not conclusive, and we need to be more honest about that. And then we got to keep out from court entirely junk science that has no validity, no basis, like bite mark evidence. Shaken baby, that we almost executed a man yesterday in America who was convicted of a shaken baby, a 2-year-old. And part of the reason that the suspicion started focusing on him when he brought his daughter to the hospital was because the detective said he seemed kind of cold and emotionally detached. And in fact, the gentleman has autism, which is one of the hallmarks, is that you have this you lack social cues, and your emotional responses to things are going to be different. It has nothing to do with whether you're guilty.
No.
And so in this case, the detective himself in that case advocated to spare this man's life. He believes he was innocent. And that there was evidence the child died of something completely different, pneumonia, that had nothing to do with any crime at all. So we almost executed a man. Now, it's temporarily been stayed. He may still be executed. But that kind of science now, while it used to be prevalent, that experts would say this happens, now it is highly challenged. A vast portion of the experts in the world say that they're, including the very scientist who coined the phrase "shaken baby," later realized, hey, these people are using this to convict people. I wasn't using it as proof that there was a crime. All I was saying is that this is a way in which, one explanation for how these kinds of injuries can occur. It doesn't mean because you see these injuries, it was caused by shaking. It's a complete misuse of even the original scientists. So that's junk science. It needs to be kept out of court altogether because jurors aren't equipped to make those kinds of judgments about what's really reliable or not. And neither are defense attorneys often equipped or resourced to bring in experts to counter the state's experts all the time.
Fascinating. Ned, do you have other question?
Yes, I do. I have a very short question that this could be the final one if you want, Jerry. And it would be there was a documentary series that was made recently called Convicting a Murderer by Candace Owens and Daily Wire Plus that argued for Stephen Avery's guilt. And again, it's two part. Number one, did you watch it? Number two, do you have any responses or feedback or comments about it?
I did not watch it. I watched some of the episodes, the early ones, the free ones, and it was obvious to me that this documentary was guilty of the very thing they accuse the Making a Murderer documentarians, which is bias. They were relying on innuendo and challenges to Stephen Avery's character and his past, and none of which had anything to do with his guilt in this particular case.
No.
So I was very unimpressed with it, as was the general marketplace for. I mean, they tried to sell that documentary to all the major outlets, like I'm sure Netflix or HBO or something, and nobody would buy it. Finally, they just had to release it online on this small little outlet that slants highly right wing. So no, I was not impressed with it, and I don't think it changed many people's minds. It may have changed some who only watched the documentary and didn't do any additional research. I think very few people who actually have looked at the other evidence that didn't even make it into Making a Murderer. Um, I think probably very few of them had their minds changed by that.
And what you say, Jerry, is very true because a lot of people have only seen Making a Murderer, and after convicting a murderer, they've changed their mind. But this is people who were, let's say, on my side and on our side, that Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey was innocent. And just because this stupid documentary comes out, they change their mind. But like you said, you need to go deeper in the case. You need to study, to take the time to learn everything you can about the case before talking about this case. It's true.
Well,
Uh,
hopefully people will do that. I mean, there's obviously there's going to be different interest levels of people who want to spend the time.
yeah,
Not everybody is going to dig through every single piece. But one of the interesting things about this case is if they care about justice and how the justice system works, this is a unique case where they can actually do that because the background evidence is available to the public
yeah,
now. It's online. You can read the reports. You can make research it and make your own judgment about
yeah, yeah.
his innocence or guilt. You don't have to rely on any documentarian, whether
No,
it's from Making a Murder or the Convicting a Murderer
no,
documentarian.
you don't need. No,
So, I would urge people to do that. And I think when they do, they'll have many, many more questions than were even addressed by that documentary, or either one, frankly.
I agree. Ned or Jerry, do you have seen some question in the chat during our interview?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And Jerry, how are you doing on time?
I think I'm going to have to leave here. I've got plans. So
Okay, no problem.
I'm sure
Understand completely.
we could go on for hours and hours and hours. And some
Yeah,
people probably have. I haven't looked at all the comments, of course, but some people probably have more specific questions about this one piece of evidence or
yeah,
not. And there are people. It's been a long time since I actually tried this case now, and I remember
almost
a lot of
20
it.
years. Yeah,
I remember a lot of it, and I remember a lot of the details, but there are lots, really specific ones that I just don't, because I haven't read the police reports as recently as many other people have. So I probably couldn't answer those kinds of questions. Somebody asked about the Siki letter,
oh yeah,
SIKY
the CT key letter. Yeah,
and Sikiki. And I remember that, it what it meant was always a mystery to us. It was highly suspicious that it was the way it was mailed, and from post office in Green Bay, as I recall, or something. But
Yes.
what it meant, and whether it could answer questions, it's always been this mystery. So those are the kind of details I couldn't even answer anyway.
No, and it was almost 20 years ago, so we could understand. Last question: are you still in touch with Dean?
I am, yes. Dean is a very good friend of mine. He's a law professor. He's still practicing, but he's a law professor in Chicago at Loyola Law School, and we see each other. He lives an hour and a half away or so from me, so we don't see each other all the time, but we stay in touch, and whenever we can get together, we do. He's a great guy. I really enjoyed working with him on the trial, and then going through the whole making a murderer experience with a global exposure and speaking, and trying to address the broken parts of our justice system here, and that we share with a lot of other countries that also have broken justice systems.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's a great guy. I'm really one of my best friends. All
So,
right.
thank you very much, Jerry. It was a big pleasure for me to receive you and Ned.
Yes,
And
Jerry, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
thank you for your time, and thank you to be who you are. You are a great human being, and
Thank you.
I like people like you because you're true. You are yourself, and this is kind of people I really like.
All right, I appreciate that. You guys have a good evening.
Yeah, you too. Thank you very much, Mr. Pilking.
Okay.
Yes,
See you
take care.
soon.
Are we off at any